think environmental justice is a term that recognizes that low-income, minority, marginalized communities often are disproportionately exposed to environmental harms and don't have access to environmental benefits, clean air, clean water, like the rest of the world. And as a legal matter, in the US, it really dates from an executive order from 1994 that President Clinton signed. And it has some legal meaning, but I think it doesn't have the teeth that a lot of people wish it had in terms of really providing a tool to remedy a lot of injustices that we see. I think, like you, when I was an undergraduate, I was very interested in environmental issues and issues of social justice and of poverty. And it was something that I had studied as an undergraduate. I spent some time working overseas in India and saw firsthand the realities of people living without basic access to water and other basic resources. And then I started my legal career as a poverty lawyer, where I saw firsthand, worked with people who were facing challenges in accessing just the basic necessities of life: housing, sufficient income. And when I had the opportunity to become an academic, I really combined my earlier interests in environmental issues with my interests in poverty law and human rights, and thus really began focusing on the right to water and sanitation. I think what a human rights perspective gives us is, first, a recognition that as a matter of human dignity, everyone's entitled to at least a basic amount of sufficient, safe, affordable access to water and sanitation. And it's a reminder that every human needs water and needs access to something as basic as clean water, good sanitation for a healthy life. I think by using human rights language, we're doing a couple of things. I think, one, we're connecting concepts like environmental justice, which has a lot of resonance in the US context, up to a global level and connecting across geographic boundaries. In addition, I think that a human rights perspective heightens awareness of certain issues, and even if there isn't a specifically recognized right to water and sanitation in US national law, it at least provides a way for advocates to be thinking about how can we be using other laws, civil rights laws, environmental laws, to really bring attention to these problems. And finally, I think a human rights perspective on policy shifts how we think about information. That rather than just saying, okay, great, 95% of people have access to clean water and sanitation, but what about those 5%? Are they always the same people who are disproportionately burdened? Are they communities of color? Are they poor communities? Should we be really focusing our efforts on helping those communities that have faced historic discrimination and face challenges in accessing many different key aspects of life, and including water? So why don't we have a right to air? That's not recognized in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights either, but yet it's also so fundamental. I think the reason that water became an issue that became the focus of the human rights community is because we began to see it as a scarce resource. That we were in many parts of the world, scarcity was a problem, and that there was a conflict between different uses of water. In addition, I think that the story of the recognition of the right to water and sanitation as human rights is also intertwined with the debate around privatization. As you know, under international law, third-party service providers, i.e. private sector parties, can in fact be involved in the delivery of water and sanitation services, because water is no different than something like food or housing, where we expect the private sector to be involved. But we have had some really disastrous examples of privatization, with probably the most notorious being the famed water wars of Cochabamba, Bolivia, which was really the poster child for what not to do when involving a private sector entity in the delivery of water and sanitation services. And I think that really galvanized people's attention around water as a scarce resource. And even in Bolivia, when they had passed a law that allowed them to charge wells that indigenous communities had even built, there was a sense that you are charging fees for water that we actually used our own resources to dig these wells. And there's often a common saying that people like to say that, well, God may have created water, but he forgot to build the pipes. The idea that how could we recognize water as a right because there is a huge infrastructure that's required to deliver clean water and sanitation to people. That's no doubt, that's true. But as I've already said, under human rights law, there's no expectation that water and sanitation services are free, but they should be affordable. And frankly, I could probably pay more for my water than I do, but poorer communities need at least basic access. The other thing that I want to mention is that we often think of certain rights, like the right not to be detained, the right not to be arbitrarily arrested, as being free. These are rights we're just asking the government to lay off of our rights. But in fact, it requires a trained police. It requires courts. It requires the government allocating some resources to pay for counsel. It requires jails that are humane. There's a lot of expenditures of societal resources that are also go into protecting all of our rights. And for me, I see something as basic as ensuring that everyone has access to water and sanitation as being something that we as a society should do. I think one of the challenges about addressing water is that water is fundamentally a local problem. In one community you have too much water, in another community you have not enough water. In one community you have problems where you have pipes, but the pipes, there's not sufficient water to actually run water through the pipes, which in turn leads to water quality problems. In another community, like where you're working in Lowndes County, Alabama, you have soils that don't allow particular kinds of septic systems to work. So it's a fundamentally challenging problem. I think we have technological solutions. The question is, are we going to prioritize making the investments that are needed? America's water infrastructure has been graded a D. Pipes are underground. We can't see them. They're not part of our, we expect to turn on the taps and water to be there, but we forget about the entire infrastructure that is invisible to us. And I think that we have to make a commitment, and we're having, at least in the US, recognition with problems of concerns about water safety and about proper access to sanitation, that this is something that we really do need to address. But in my mind, it's really about ensuring that we bring the resources to a problem. But first, the challenge is recognizing that this is a problem that exists. I think it's really important to be an engaged person in society, that you have tremendous resources at your disposal, especially if you are right now at a university and you're learning and you have these opportunities that people all around the world would love to have. And the question is, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to actually use the knowledge and the tools and the skills that you've gained to try to make the world a better place? And I think recognizing something like the challenges of environmental justice, these are problems that we know that exist. We need more creative people to be raising the sirens, to be developing solutions, and to be working collaboratively, because frankly, you're the next leaders of our country and of our world. So I hope you keep on keeping up the good fight.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.